Tommy was having the worst week of his life. His boss at the accounting firm had just passed him over for another promotion. His rent was due in 3 days, and his car was making that weird noise again. He sat in his tiny Chicago apartment, staring at a stack of bills on his kitchen table, wondering how he was going to make ends meet this month. That's when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize from some small town in Montana. "Hello, is this Tommy Rodriguez?" asked a woman's voice. "Yeah, that's me. Who's this?" "This is Patricia Williams from Williams and Associates law firm. I'm calling about your great-uncle Harold's estate." Tommy scratched his head. Uncle Harold? He barely remembered the guy. He'd met him maybe twice at family reunions when he was a kid. Harold was that weird relative who lived alone in the mountains and always smelled like pine trees and old books. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think you have the wrong person. I haven't talked to Uncle Harold in like 15 years. Well, Mr. Rodriguez, according to his will, he's left you his property in Montana, a cabin in about 20 acres of land." Tommy nearly dropped the phone. "He left me what now?" "A cabin, sir. It's located about 40 miles outside of Glacier Falls, Montana. Quite remote, I'm told. The will specifically names you as the sole beneficiary of this property." After hanging up, Tommy just sat there for a good 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. A cabin? In Montana? Why would Uncle Harold leave him anything? They barely knew each other. His first call was to his mom. "Tommy, how are you, sweetie?" she answered cheerfully. "Mom, did you know Uncle Harold died?" There was a pause. "Oh, Harold. Yes, I heard something about that a few weeks ago. Such a strange man." "Why do you ask?" "He left me his cabin." His mother actually laughed. "He left you what?" "Oh, honey, that old shack. I visited there once with your father back in the 80s. It's falling apart in the middle of nowhere. There's probably nothing left but rotting wood and mouse droppings. But, Mom, it's 20 acres of land. That has to be worth something, right?" "Sweetie, it's 20 acres of rocks and pine trees where nobody wants to live. You'd be lucky to get $5,000 for the whole thing. Honestly, you should just sign it over to the state and forget about it." Tommy's next call was to his girlfriend Lisa. They'd been dating for 2 years, and she was always practical about money stuff. "A cabin?" Lisa said when he told her. "Tommy, please tell me you're not thinking of keeping it." "I don't know. Maybe I should at least go look at it." "Look at it?" "Tommy, you can't afford to take time off work to go hiking around Montana. And for what? Some rundown shack that probably doesn't even have electricity?" "The lawyer said it comes with 20 acres. Lisa sighed loudly. 20 acres of what? Desert? Swampland? "Tommy, think about this logically. If this property was worth anything, why would some old hermit live there alone for 30 years? Why wouldn't he have sold it and moved somewhere nice?" That evening, Tommy met his buddy Jake for drinks at their usual spot downtown. "Dude, you inherited a cabin?" Jake laughed so hard he almost spit out his beer. "That's the most random thing I've ever heard." "What are you gonna do? Become a mountain man?" "I'm thinking about driving out there next weekend to check it out." "Are you serious?" "Tommy, you get lost trying to find the suburban Walmart. Now, you want to go wandering around the wilderness? What if you get eaten by a bear?" "There probably aren't any bears." "Probably?" "Dude, this is Montana we're talking about. There are definitely bears and wolves, and probably crazy mountain people who haven't seen civilization in 20 years. Jake took another sip of his beer and shook his head. "Look, I get it. Free property sounds exciting, but think about it. What are you really gonna find out there? A bunch of broken windows, a leaky roof, and maybe some old furniture that smells like mothballs. You'd spend more money on gas driving out there than the whole place is worth." The next day at work, word had somehow gotten around the office about Tommy's inheritance. During his lunch break, his coworkers gathered around his desk like he was some kind of entertainment. "So, Tommy's gonna be a cowboy now," said Mike from the next cubicle. "Hope you like eating beans out of a can." "I heard those mountain cabins don't even have indoor plumbing," added Jennifer from accounting. "You might be using an outhouse for the rest of your life. Or better yet," Mike continued, "maybe you'll find a treasure map like in the movies. X marks the spot, right, Tommy? Everyone laughed, but not in a mean way. They were just having fun. With him, still, Tommy felt embarrassed. Maybe they were right. Maybe this whole thing was just a waste of time. That weekend, Tommy's family had their monthly dinner at his Aunt Rosa's house. Of course, the cabin became the main topic of conversation. Tommy got a cabin from crazy Uncle Harold, his cousin. Danny announced to the whole table, "That old place?" Uncle Roberto laughed. "I remember Harold talking about that dump 20 years ago. He was always going on about his research and his important work. The guy was probably just lonely and making stuff up to feel important." "What kind of research?" Tommy asked. "Who knows? He had some kind of college degree, geology or something, but he never had a real job that anyone knew about. Just lived off his savings and played around in the dirt." Aunt Carmen chimed in. "I always felt sorry for him. Living all alone like that, no family nearby, no friends. It's not natural for a person to isolate themselves like that." "Well, now it's Tommy's problem," said Danny. "What are you gonna do with it, cousin? Turn it into a vacation rental?" "Vacation rental?" Uncle Roberto almost choked on his food. "Who's gonna vacation in the middle of nowhere, Montana? People want beaches and hotels and restaurants, not some falling down cabin where you have to chop your own firewood." Tommy's mom patted his hand. "Sweetie, I know this seems exciting, but be practical. You have a life here in Chicago. You have your job, your apartment, your girlfriend. Don't throw all that away, chasing some fantasy about mountain living." "I'm not throwing anything away, Mom. I just want to see what it looks like." "And then what?" "Say you drive all the way out there and it's exactly what we think it is. An old, broken-down cabin that would cost more to fix than it's worth. Then you've wasted a vacation week and probably $1,000 in travel expenses." By Sunday night, Tommy was starting to doubt himself. Everyone in his life, his family, his girlfriend, his friends, his coworkers, they all seemed to agree. This inheritance was more of a burden than a blessing. Uncle Harold had probably left him the cabin because he knew no one else would want it, but there was something nagging at Tommy. Maybe it was just stubbornness. Or maybe it was curiosity, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was being too quick to judge. Sure, Uncle Harold was odd, but he wasn't stupid. He had a college degree. He'd managed to live independently for decades. Why would he hold on to a completely worthless piece of property for so long? And there was something else. When Tommy was about 10 years old, Uncle Harold had visited for Christmas. While the adults were talking in the living room, Harold had pulled Tommy aside and shown him a small, unusual rock. "This came from my backyard," Harold had whispered like it was a secret. "Most people look at rocks and see nothing special. But if you know what to look for, sometimes you find amazing things." Tommy had kept that rock for years before eventually losing it during a move. But he remembered how excited Uncle Harold had seemed, how his eyes lit up when he talked about finding treasures that other people walked right past. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe the cabin was worthless. But Tommy decided he had to find out for himself. Tommy stared at his laptop screen for the 100th time, looking at the route from Chicago to Glacier Falls, Montana. 18 hours of driving. He'd never driven that far in his life. His car, a 10-year-old Honda with 180,000 miles on it, was about to get the test of its lifetime. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" Lisa said from the kitchen. She was making coffee, but Tommy could hear the frustration in her voice. They'd been arguing about this trip for 3 days straight. "I have to, Lisa. I can't stop thinking about it." "You're using your vacation days for this." "Your only vacation days? We were supposed to go to Florida next month, remember?" Tommy closed the laptop and walked into the kitchen. Lisa was standing with her back to him, aggressively stirring sugar into her coffee. "Look, if the cabin is really as worthless as everyone says, I'll be back in 4 days. We can still do Florida in the fall." Lisa turned around and Tommy could see she'd been crying a little. "It's not about Florida, Tommy. It's about you making decisions without thinking them through. What if your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere? What if you get hurt and there's no cell service? What if you run out of money? I've got a roadside assistance. And I'm not hiking Mount Everest." I'm just driving to look at a cabin. A cabin that might not even exist anymore. Tommy, this inheritance happened because a lonely old man felt guilty about never staying in touch with family. That doesn't mean he left you something valuable? But Tommy had already made up his mind. That afternoon, he packed a small bag, filled up his car, and started the longest drive of his life. The first few hours weren't bad. Illinois highways were familiar, and he made good time through Wisconsin. He'd loaded his phone with podcasts and audiobooks, figuring he'd learn something during the drive. But as the sun started setting and he crossed into Minnesota, reality began to hit him. He was really doing this. He was driving across the country to look at a property he'd never seen, left to him by a man he barely knew, against the advice of everyone who cared about him. Tommy stopped for the night at a budget motel outside Minneapolis. The room smelled like old cigarettes and the air conditioner made weird noises, but it was cheap and clean enough. He called Lisa to let her know he was okay. "How's the drive?" she asked. Her voice was softer now, less angry. "Long, really long. I'm starting to understand why people fly places. It's not too late to turn around, you know." Tommy looked out the motel window at the highway. Cars were still streaming by even at 9 o'clock at night, their headlights disappearing into the darkness. "I know, but I'm already here. Might as well see it through." The next morning, Tommy grabbed coffee and a breakfast sandwich from a gas station and got back on the road. The landscape started changing as he drove west through Minnesota and into North Dakota. The cities got smaller, the spaces between them got bigger, and there were fewer cars on the highway. By afternoon, he was in Montana, and the scenery was like nothing he'd ever seen. Mountains rose up in the distance like something from a postcard. The sky seemed bigger somehow, stretched out forever above rolling hills and grasslands. But as beautiful as it was, Tommy was starting to feel very alone. He'd been driving for almost 12 hours, and his phone showed only 2 bars of service. The radio stations kept fading in and out, leaving him with static and the sound of his tires on the highway. When he finally reached Glacier Falls, Tommy was surprised by how small it was. The whole town looked like it had maybe 2,000 people. There was a main street with a few shops, a diner, a gas station, and not much else. Everyone seemed to know each other, and they all looked at Tommy's Illinois license plates with curiosity. He stopped at the diner for lunch and asked the waitress about directions to Uncle Harold's property. "Oh, you mean old Harold Regessa's place?" she said. "You family?" "Great nephew. I inherited the cabin." The waitress, whose name tag said Betty, raised her eyebrows. "Well, I'll be." Harold used to come into town about once a month for supplies. Kept to himself mostly, but he was always polite. Real quiet guy. "Do you know how to get to his place?" "Honey, that's way up in the hills. You're gonna need a truck or at least something with 4-wheel drive. The road up there isn't really a road, if you know what I mean." Tommy looked out at his Honda and felt his heart sink. "How bad is it?" Well, Harold had an old pickup truck, and even he had trouble sometimes, especially in winter or after heavy rains. "You might make it in that car of yours, but I wouldn't recommend it." Betty gave him directions anyway, and Tommy bought a detailed local map just in case his phone GPS stopped working. The drive from town was supposed to take about 45 minutes on good roads. On the dirt roads leading to Harold's cabin, it could take twice that. Tommy left Glacier Falls feeling nervous for the first time since starting this trip. The paved road ended after about 20 miles, and then he was driving on gravel that got rougher the further he went. His Honda wasn't built for this kind of terrain, and he could hear rocks pinging against the bottom of his car, the road wound. Up into the hills, getting narrower and steeper with every mile. Pine trees closed in on both sides, and Tommy started to understand why Uncle Harold had lived such an isolated life. This wasn't the kind of place you visited casually. You had to really want to be here after what felt like hours of careful driving. Tommy finally saw a mailbox with Rodriguez painted on it in faded letters. A narrow dirt driveway disappeared into the trees. His phone showed no service at all now. The driveway was even worse than the main road. Tommy's car scraped bottom twice, and he had to get out once to move a fallen branch. But finally, after one last turn, he saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. And it was exactly as bad as everyone had said. It would be. The roof was covered with tarps and missing shingles. One of the front windows was boarded up with plywood. The porch sagged on one side, and the whole structure looked like it was slowly sinking into the ground. Weeds and small trees had grown up around the foundation, and there was a rusty old pickup truck parked beside the cabin that looked like it hadn't run in years. Tommy sat in his car for a long minute just staring. This was it. This was what he'd driven 18 hours to see. A falling down cabin in the middle of nowhere. That would probably cost more to demolish than it was worth. He could almost hear his family laughing. Lisa had been right. His coworkers had been right. Everyone had been right except him, but he was here now, so he might as well take a look inside. Tommy got out of his car and walked toward the cabin. The front door was locked, but the lawyer had mailed him the keys. As he fumbled with the old lock, he noticed something strange. Despite how run down the outside looked, the door was solid wood and the lock was newer than he'd expected. The door opened with a loud creak, and Tommy stepped inside. The cabin was dark and smelled like old wood and dust, but it wasn't as bad as he'd feared. The main room had a stone fireplace, some basic furniture covered with sheets, and shelves lined with books. There was a small kitchen area and what looked like 2 bedrooms, but the weirdest thing was how clean everything was. Sure, there was dust and cobwebs, but the cabin didn't look abandoned. It looked like someone had been taking care of it right up until recently. Tommy found a light switch and was surprised when it actually worked. Uncle Harold had electricity after all. As his eyes adjusted to the light, Tommy started noticing details that didn't match the rundown exterior. The floorboards were solid and well-maintained. The windows, except for the boarded-up one, were clean and in good condition. The kitchen had a modern refrigerator and a working stove. This wasn't the shack everyone had described. Someone had put time and money into keeping this place livable. Tommy spent the next hour exploring, finding a generator shed out back, a well-organized workshop area, and even a small bathroom with indoor plumbing. Uncle Harold hadn't been living like a hermit at all. He'd been living like someone who valued privacy and self-sufficiency. As evening approached, Tommy realized he had a decision to make. Drive back to town in the dark on those terrible roads or spend the night in the cabin. His rational mind said to leave, but something about this place was making him curious. Why had Harold gone to so much trouble to make people think this cabin was worthless when it clearly wasn't? Tommy decided to stay. He found some canned food in the kitchen and figured out how to start the generator for heat. As darkness fell outside, he sat by the fireplace and tried to make sense of what he'd discovered. Everyone had been wrong about Uncle Harold's cabin. The question was, what else had they been wrong about? Tommy woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then reality hit him. He was lying on a dusty couch in his dead great-uncle's cabin in the middle of Montana. His back ached from sleeping on the old cushions, but he'd actually slept better than he had in weeks. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the cabin looked completely different in the daylight. What had seemed spooky and mysterious the night before now just looked like an old but well-maintained home. Tommy could see why Uncle Harold had chosen to live here. It was peaceful in a way that his noisy Chicago apartment never was. After making coffee with supplies he'd found in the kitchen, Tommy decided to start cleaning. If he was going to figure out what to do with this place, he needed to see what he was working with. He started in the main room, pulling sheets off furniture and opening windows to let in fresh air. The furniture was older but solid, real wood. Not the particle board stuff from his apartment. Uncle Harold had good taste, even if he didn't care much about keeping up appearances on the outside. Tommy was moving a heavy wooden chest when he heard something shift inside it. The chest wasn't locked, so he opened it up. Inside, he found photo albums, old letters, and what looked like Uncle Harold's personal papers. Tommy felt a little weird going through someone else's private stuff, but technically it was his stuff now. The photos were interesting. Most showed Uncle Harold at different stages of his life, as a young man in a college graduation photo, standing next to mining equipment in various locations, camping in beautiful mountain areas, There were also pictures of the cabin being built, showing that Harold had done a lot of the work himself, but it was the letters that really caught Tommy's attention. They were correspondence between Harold and various geology professors, mining companies, and government agencies. The language was technical and hard to understand. But one thing was clear: Uncle Harold had been way more educated and connected than anyone in the family realized. Tommy found college transcripts showing that Harold had graduated with honors from the Colorado School of Mines with a degree in geological engineering. There were letters of recommendation from professors calling him brilliant and one of our most promising students. This wasn't some lonely hermit playing around in the dirt. This was a trained professional who knew what he was doing. As Tommy continued cleaning, he started noticing other things that didn't add up. The cabin had way more electrical outlets than a simple mountain home would need. There were heavy-duty extension cords running to the workshop area, and the workshop itself was locked with a combination lock that looked brand new. Tommy tried a few obvious combinations: Harold's birthday, the year the cabin was built, simple sequences like 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing worked. But then he remembered something from the letters. Harold's student ID number from college appeared on several documents. Tommy tried those 4 digits, and the lock clicked open. The workshop was like stepping into a different world. This wasn't just a place to fix broken tools. It was a serious laboratory. There were microscopes, scales that looked like they could measure tiny amounts, computers that seemed way too advanced for a mountain cabin, and equipment that Tommy didn't recognize but looked expensive and important. One wall was covered with detailed maps of the local area. But these weren't normal hiking maps. They showed geological features, elevation changes, and were marked with dozens of colored pins and handwritten notes. Some areas were circled in red, others in blue, and there were measurements and dates written everywhere. On the main workbench, Tommy found several notebooks filled with Harold's handwriting. The entries were dated going back almost 15 years, and they read like a scientist's research journal. Harold had been systematically exploring and documenting every square mile of the surrounding mountains. Most of the technical language went over Tommy's head, but certain phrases kept appearing: promising formations, significant mineralization, requires further analysis, and potential commercial value. Whatever Harold had been doing out here, he thought he'd found something worth studying for decades. Tommy was getting excited now. This was like finding buried treasure, except instead of gold coins, he was finding evidence that Uncle Harold had been conducting serious scientific research. But research into what? He continued searching through the workshop and found a filing cabinet with more detailed records. The files were organized by location, with names like North Ridge Survey and Pine Creek Formation Analysis. Each file contained maps, photographs, and pages of notes about rock samples and mineral content, but it was the file labeled Personal Log Confidential that made Tommy's heart race. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. After 28 years of systematic exploration, I'm confident that I've located a significant rare earth element deposit in the North Ridge Formation. Initial samples show concentrations of lithium, cobalt, and other valuable minerals that exceed my most optimistic projections. This could be one of the largest undiscovered deposits in North America. Tommy had to read that twice. Rare earth elements? He'd heard those mentioned on the news before. Weren't those the materials used in cell phones and electric car batteries? The stuff that was super valuable because most of it came from other countries? He kept reading. The challenge now is determining how to proceed. Commercial mining would require environmental impact studies, partnerships with established companies, and significant capital investment. But done correctly, this discovery could generate enough revenue to fund conservation efforts throughout the region while providing economic opportunities for local communities. The entries continued for pages, detailing Harold's careful analysis of his findings and his plans for responsible development. But what struck Tommy most was the tone of the writing. This wasn't the work of someone playing around with rocks as a hobby. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what he'd found and understood its value. The final entry was dated Just 2 months before Harold's death, I've decided to leave everything to Tommy. He's young enough to see this through properly, and I believe he has the integrity to handle this discovery responsibly. The family always thought I was wasting my time out here, but Tommy was different. Even as a child, he listened when I talked about finding treasures that others overlook. I hope he'll understand that this land is worth more than anyone imagines, but only if it's developed with respect for the environment and the community. Tommy sat down hard in Harold's desk chair. His great-uncle had left him more than just a cabin in some land. He'd left him what could potentially be worth millions of dollars, but Tommy's excitement was mixed with confusion and a little fear. If this was all true, why hadn't Harold told anyone? Why live like a hermit when he was sitting on top of a fortune? And why leave it all to Tommy, someone he barely knew? Tommy spent the rest of the day going through Harold's research, trying to understand what he'd inherited. The maps showed that the most promising areas were about 2 miles north of the cabin. In a remote section of mountainside that Harold owned but had never developed, there were photographs of rock formations, detailed chemical analyses of soil, samples, and even correspondence with an environmental consulting firm about sustainable mining practices. Harold had been planning this for years, but he'd been planning it carefully, making sure that any development would be done right. As evening approached, Tommy realized he needed to make some decisions. He could pack up, drive home, and try to forget about all this. He could sell the land to the first person who made an offer and walk away with whatever quick cash he could get. Or he could try to figure out if Harold's research was accurate and if this discovery was really as valuable. As it seemed, Tommy looked around the workshop one more time. Everything about this place showed that Harold had been methodical, careful, and professional in his work. The man had spent 15 years of his life documenting every detail of this discovery. That wasn't the behavior of someone who was confused or mistaken, but it was also clear that Harold had been keeping this secret for a reason. Maybe he was waiting for the right time, or the right person, or the right opportunity. And now, for better or worse, that responsibility had fallen to Tommy. Tommy made his decision. He was going to spend another day at the cabin, studying Harold's research and trying to understand exactly what he'd inherited. Then he was going to hike up to the North Ridge Formation and see for himself what Harold had been so excited about. Everyone back home thought he was wasting his time on a worthless piece of property. But if Harold's research was accurate, Tommy might be sitting on one of the most valuable undiscovered mineral deposits in the country. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Tommy barely slept that second night. His mind was racing with everything he'd discovered in Harold's workshop. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured those maps with their red circles and detailed notes. By sunrise, he was already up, making coffee and studying Harold's research notes by the morning light. The trail to the North Ridge Formation was marked clearly on Harold's maps. It looked like about a 2-mile hike through fairly rough terrain, but Harold had marked the route carefully, noting landmarks and potential hazards along the way. Tommy found a backpack in the cabin's closet, along with hiking boots that were close enough to his size. Before heading out, Tommy packed water, some snacks, Harold's detailed maps, and a small digital camera he'd brought from Chicago. He also grabbed one of Harold's rock hammers and a collection bag, figuring he might want to take his own samples. The first part of the hike was easier than Tommy expected. Harold had created a decent trail that wound up through the pine forest behind the cabin. The morning air was crisp and clean, nothing like the smoggy atmosphere back in Chicago. Tommy could understand why Harold had chosen to live out here, even if the isolation would have driven most people crazy. About 30 minutes into the hike, Tommy reached the first landmark Harold had marked, a distinctive boulder shaped like a giant egg. Harold's note said to turn northeast here and follow a natural ridge line up toward the rock formations. Tommy checked his compass and started climbing. The terrain got rougher as he climbed higher. The trees thinned out and the ground became rocky and steep. Tommy had to stop several times to catch his breath. He was in decent shape from walking around Chicago, but this mountain hiking was a whole different challenge. After another hour of climbing, Tommy saw what Harold had been writing about. Ahead of him, the mountainside opened up into a series of rocky outcroppings and small cliff faces. The stone here was different from what he'd seen lower down, darker, with streaks of different colors running through it like veins. Tommy pulled out Harold's maps and tried to orient himself. According to the notes, he was looking for a particular formation that Harold had labeled Site Alpha, a place where the rock showed unusual mineral content and coloration. It took Tommy another 20 minutes of careful searching before he found it. Site Alpha was a section of exposed rock face where the stone showed distinct bands of different colors: gray, brown, and what looked like patches of metallic green and blue. Even to Tommy's untrained eye, this looked different from normal mountain rock. Tommy took photos from every angle, then used Harold's rock hammer to chip off a few small samples. The rock was harder than he expected, but he managed to collect several pieces that showed the unusual coloration Harold had noted in his research. Following Harold's maps, Tommy spent the next 3 hours exploring different sites throughout the formation. Each location Harold had marked showed similar unusual rock formations and mineral deposits. Tommy wasn't a geologist, but even he could see that something was different about this area. At Site Delta, Tommy found something that made his heart race. In a small cave opening that Harold had documented, the walls actually sparkled in his flashlight beam. Tiny crystals embedded in the rock reflected the light like stars. Tommy had never seen anything like it outside of a museum. He carefully collected samples from this location too, making sure to photograph everything and note the exact GPS coordinates using Harold's handheld device. If Harold's research was correct, these samples could confirm the presence of valuable rare earth elements, but it was at the final location, Site Echo, that Tommy found the real treasure. Harold's notes described Site Echo as the most promising formation, highest concentration of target minerals. It was the hardest location to reach, requiring Tommy to climb down into a narrow canyon and then up a series of natural rock steps. When Tommy finally reached the site, he understood why Harold had been so excited. The entire rock face was streaked with metallic veins that caught the sunlight like precious metal. The stone here was unlike anything Tommy had ever seen, dense and heavy, with patches that actually looked like they contained flakes of real metal. Tommy spent over an hour at Site Echo taking detailed photographs and collecting the best samples he could find. Some of the rock was so dense it felt like it might contain actual metal, or if these samples contained the rare earth elements Harold thought they did, Tommy was looking at potentially millions of dollars worth of untapped resources. As he prepared to head back to the cabin, Tommy realized that Harold's research was probably accurate. You didn't spend 15 years documenting worthless rock formations. Harold had been a trained geologist who knew what to look for, and everything Tommy had seen that day supported Harold's conclusions. The hike back to the cabin gave Tommy time to think about what this all meant. If Harold was right, Tommy now owned land containing valuable mineral deposits that could change his life forever. But he also understood why Harold had kept this discovery secret for so long. Developing a mine, even a small one, would require environmental permits, partnerships with mining companies, and probably years of legal and regulatory work. It would also completely change this beautiful, peaceful area. Tommy could see why Harold had been careful about how to proceed. Back at the cabin, Tommy spread his rock samples out on Harold's workbench and compared them to the samples Harold had collected. Over the years, the similarities were obvious. The same unusual coloration, the same metallic streaks, the same heavy density that suggested valuable mineral content. Tommy spent that evening reading through more of Harold's research, trying to understand the bigger picture. Harold hadn't just found some interesting rocks. He'd systematically mapped and analyzed what appeared to be a significant mineral deposit that extended throughout several square miles of mountainside. The more Tommy read, the more impressed he became with Harold's thoroughness. Harold had researched similar deposits around the world, studied market prices for rare earth elements, and even developed preliminary plans for environmentally responsible extraction methods. In one file, Tommy found Harold's conservative estimates of the deposit's value. Even using the lowest projected market prices and assuming only partial extraction, Harold calculated that the mineral rights could be worth between $50 and $100 million. Tommy had to read that number 3 times before it sank. In $100 million. More money than he could even imagine? Enough money to never worry about rent or car payments or getting passed over for promotions ever again? But Harold's notes also included warnings about the complexity of developing such a discovery. Mining operations required massive capital investments, environmental impact studies, and partnerships with companies that had the expertise and equipment to extract valuable minerals safely and legally. Harold had also noted the importance of protecting the surrounding wilderness and respecting the local community. Any mining operation would need to be planned carefully to minimize environmental damage and provide benefits to the people who lived in the area. As Tommy studied Harold's research late into the night, he began to understand the burden Harold had carried. Having knowledge of such a valuable discovery was both a blessing and a responsibility. Harold had spent years trying to figure out the right way to develop these resources without destroying the land he loved. Now that responsibility belonged to Tommy, Tommy's phone had no signal at the cabin, so he couldn't call anyone or do any internet research about rare earth element prices. But he didn't need current market data to understand that Harold had left him something extraordinary. The question was what to do next. Tommy knew he needed professional confirmation of Harold's findings. He needed to have the rock samples analyzed by qualified geologists. He needed to research the legal aspects of mineral rights and mining permits. And he needed to figure out how to proceed without attracting the wrong kind of attention. Tommy also realized that he couldn't keep this discovery to himself much longer. Eventually, he would need legal advice, professional partnerships, and probably significant financial investment to turn Harold's discovery into actual value. But for now, Tommy was the only person who knew what Harold had really found up in those mountains. And based on everything he'd seen that day, Harold's research appeared to be completely accurate. Tommy was sitting on what could be one of the most valuable undiscovered mineral deposits in North America. The same people who had laughed at him for inheriting a worthless cabin had no idea what he'd actually inherited. The question was, how long could he keep this secret, and what was he going to do with it? Tommy spent his last morning at the cabin carefully packing the rock samples he'd collected. He wrapped each piece in newspaper and labeled them with the exact location where he'd found them. Just like Harold's notes showed, his plan was simple. Drive back to Glacier Falls, find someone who could test these samples, and get professional confirmation of what Harold had discovered. The drive down the mountain felt different this time. Instead of worrying about his car scraping bottom, on the rough road, Tommy was thinking about how to handle what might be the most important conversation of his life. How do you walk into a lab and ask someone to test rocks without sounding crazy? How do you keep something this big secret? Back in Glacier Falls, Tommy stopped at Betty's diner for lunch and to ask about local resources. "You're back," Betty said when she saw him. "How was the cabin? As bad as everyone said?" "Actually, it wasn't too bad," Tommy replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm thinking about maybe fixing it up. Listen, is there anyone around here who knows about rocks and minerals? Like a geologist or someone who works with mining?" Betty thought for a moment. "Well, there's the county extension office. They sometimes help ranchers with soil testing. And there's Dave Wilson. He used to work for the mining company over in Butte before he retired. Lives about 20 miles east of here now. What about testing labs? Somewhere I could get rock samples analyzed? Samples? What kind of samples?" Betty's curiosity was clearly piqued. Tommy realized he needed to be more careful. "Oh, just some interesting rocks I found around the property. Thought they might be worth something to collectors, you know?" "Well, the nearest real lab would probably be over in Missoula. That's about 2 hours from here. The university there has a geology department." Tommy thanked Betty and decided to try the county extension office first. It seemed less risky than driving to a major university lab with mysterious rock samples. The extension office was a small building on the edge of town. Tommy walked in carrying a small bag with a few of his least impressive samples, ones that didn't show the obvious metallic streaks that had gotten him so excited. The woman at the front desk looked to be in her 50s and had the patient expression of someone who dealt with all kinds of random requests from local residents. "Hi, I'm Tommy Rodriguez. I inherited some property from my great-uncle Harold, and I found some unusual rocks. I was wondering if you could help me figure out what they are." "Harold Rodriguez? I remember him. Nice man, very quiet. I'm Carol, by the way. Let me see what you've got." Tommy showed Carol a few of the more ordinary-looking samples. She examined them with a magnifying glass and took some notes. "These are interesting," she said. "The coloration suggests some mineral content, but I'm not really qualified to do detailed analysis. We mostly deal with soil composition for farming purposes. You'd need a real geology lab for anything comprehensive. Do you know of any labs that might be willing to test these?" Carol gave him the contact information for a geological survey company in Missoula that did mineral analysis for mining companies and private landowners. She also mentioned that they were discreet and professional, exactly what Tommy needed to hear. Tommy decided to make the drive to Missoula that afternoon. He called the lab from his car once he got back into cell phone range, and they agreed to see him if he could get there before 5 o'clock. Montana Geological Services was located in a modern office building near the university. Tommy was nervous as he walked in, carrying his carefully packed samples. The receptionist directed him to Dr. Angela Stevens, a geologist who specialized in mineral analysis. Dr. Stevens was younger than Tommy had expected, probably in her early 30s, with short brown hair and the kind of practical demeanor that inspired confidence. She invited Tommy into her office and asked what he needed. "I inherited some land from my great-uncle, and I found some rocks that seem unusual. I was hoping you could tell me what they are and if they're worth anything." "Sure, that's exactly what we do. Can I see the samples?" Tommy unwrapped his best specimens, the ones from site Echo that showed the most obvious mineral content. Dr. Stevens immediately became more interested. "These are very interesting," she said, examining the samples under a bright light. "Where exactly did you find these?" "On my property, up in the mountains near Glacier Falls." "And you said your great-uncle left you this land? Was he interested in geology at all?" Tommy decided to be partially honest. He had some kind of science background, but the family always thought he was just a hermit who played around with rocks. Dr. Stevens smiled. "Well, if he found these specimens, he knew what he was looking for. These show clear evidence of rare earth element mineralization. See these metallic streaks? And the density of these samples is much higher than ordinary rock." Tommy tried to keep his expression neutral, but his heart was racing. "Rare earth elements? What does that mean exactly?" "They're a group of metals that are essential for modern technology, things like electric car batteries, wind turbines, cell phones, computers. They're called rare not because they're necessarily scarce, but because they're usually found in very low concentrations mixed with other minerals. Are they valuable? Very valuable. The global demand keeps increasing, and most of the world's supply comes from just a few countries. Finding a domestic source, especially one with concentrations like these samples suggest, could be extremely significant." Dr. Stevens explained that she could do preliminary testing in her lab, but for comprehensive analysis, the samples would need to be sent to a specialized facility that had the equipment to measure exact concentrations and identify specific rare earth elements. "How long would that take?" Tommy asked. "The preliminary tests I can do here would take about 3 days. The comprehensive analysis would take about 2 weeks and cost around $5,000. But based on what I'm seeing in these initial samples, I'd say it's worth the investment." Tommy felt dizzy. $5,000 was more than he had in his savings account. But if these samples confirmed what Harold had documented, it would be the best investment he'd ever make. "Let's start with the preliminary testing," Tommy said. "If those results look promising, we can talk about the comprehensive analysis." Dr. Stevens prepared paperwork for the testing and explained that everything would be kept strictly confidential. She also mentioned that if the results were as promising as the initial visual inspection suggested, Tommy might want to consider having additional samples tested from different locations on his property. "One more thing," Dr. Stevens said as Tommy was leaving. "If these results confirm significant rare earth element deposits, you're going to need legal advice about mineral rights, environmental regulations, and development options. This isn't the kind of discovery you want to handle on your own." Tommy drove back toward Glacier Falls feeling like his whole world had changed. A professional geologist had just confirmed that Harold's rock samples showed exactly what Harold's research had claimed. This wasn't an old man's fantasy. This was real, but Dr. Stevens had also made it clear that developing a rare earth element mine was complicated and expensive. Tommy was going to need professional help, legal advice, and probably partners with the resources to turn a mineral discovery into an actual business. Tommy stopped at a hotel in Glacier Falls for the night. Partly because he was too excited to make the long drive home, and partly because he wanted time to think about his next steps. He called Lisa from his hotel room. "How's your treasure hunt going?" she asked, but her tone was friendlier than it had been when he left. "Actually, pretty interesting. The cabin isn't as bad as everyone thought. I might have found some things that are worth looking into." "What kind of things?" Tommy realized he wasn't ready to tell anyone the whole truth yet. "Just some interesting rocks and minerals. I'm having them tested to see if they're worth anything to collectors." "Well, that's something, I guess." "When are you coming home? Probably tomorrow or the next day?" "I want to wrap up a few more things here first." After hanging up, Tommy lay on the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling. In 3 days, he'd gone from inheriting what everyone thought was a worthless cabin to potentially owning one of the most valuable undiscovered mineral deposits in North America, but Tommy was starting to understand the burden Harold had carried. Knowledge of this discovery came with enormous responsibility. How do you develop something this valuable without destroying the environment? How do you keep from being taken advantage of by people who know more about mining and business than you do? How do you handle the kind of life-changing wealth that could come from this? Harold had spent 15 years trying to figure out the right way to handle this discovery. Now Tommy had 3 days to wait for test results that could confirm he was sitting on a fortune. The question was, would he be ready to handle what came next? Tommy made it back to Chicago late Thursday night, exhausted from the long drive but too wired to sleep. Dr. Stevens had promised to call him as soon as the preliminary test results were ready, probably by Monday or Tuesday. Tommy had never experienced 3 days that felt so long. He tried to act normal at work on Friday, but it was impossible to concentrate. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart jumped, thinking it might be news from Montana. His coworkers noticed he seemed distracted, but Tommy just told them he was tired from his trip. "So how was the cabin?" his cubicle neighbor Mike asked during lunch. "As much of a dump as everyone predicted?" "Actually, it was kind of interesting," Tommy said carefully. "I might go back sometime." "Really? You thinking about becoming a mountain man after all?" Tommy forced a laugh. "Maybe just a weekend getaway." Spot. But keeping the secret was harder than Tommy had expected. Every conversation felt like he was lying. When Lisa asked about his plans for the weekend, Tommy almost told her everything just to have someone to talk to about what was happening. Monday morning came and went with no call from Dr. Stevens. Tuesday morning dragged by even slower. Tommy was starting to worry that something had gone wrong with the tests when his phone finally rang Tuesday afternoon. "Tommy? This is Dr. Stevens from Montana Geological Services." Tommy's heart started pounding. "Hi, Dr. Stevens. Do you have results?" "I do, and they're quite remarkable. Your samples show significant concentrations of several rare earth elements, including lithium, cobalt, and neodymium. The concentrations are well above what we typically see in commercial deposits." Tommy had to sit down. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means your great-uncle appears to have found a legitimate rare earth element deposit." "Based on these samples alone, I'd estimate this could be commercially viable, but I'd strongly recommend the comprehensive analysis to get exact concentrations and a better understanding of the deposit's extent." "How comprehensive are we talking?" If these preliminary results are representative of the larger area, you could be looking at a deposit worth tens of millions of dollars, possibly more. But Tommy, I need to stress something. Word about discoveries like this has a way of getting out. You need to be very careful about who you talk to and how you proceed. After hanging up, Tommy sat in his car in the company parking lot for 20 minutes, just trying to process what he'd heard. It was real. Harold had been right. Tommy was sitting on a fortune, but Dr. Stevens's warning about word getting out proved to be prophetic. By Thursday, Tommy's phone started ringing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. The first call came while he was at work. "Is this Tommy Rodriguez? This is Bill Henderson from Mountain West Development. I understand you recently inherited some property in Montana that might be of interest to our company." Tommy's blood went cold. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "We specialize in land development and mineral rights acquisition. We'd like to discuss purchasing your property in the Glacier Falls area. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer." "How did you get my number? How do you even know about my property?" "Word gets around in our business, Mr. Rodriguez. The geology community is smaller than you might think. When someone discovers interesting mineral samples, people in our industry hear about it." Tommy hung up without saying another word. His hands were shaking. How had this information leaked so quickly? The second call came that evening. "Tommy Rodriguez? This is Janet Miller from Western Mining Consortium. We understand you've come into possession of some potentially valuable mineral rights. We'd like to set up a meeting to discuss a partnership that could be very profitable for you." Again, Tommy hung up, but now he was starting to panic. If these companies knew about his discovery, who else knew? And how many more calls was he going to get? The answer came over the next few days. By Saturday, Tommy had received calls from 6 different companies, 2 law firms, and even a reporter from a mining industry newsletter. Everyone seemed to know that Tommy Rodriguez from Chicago had inherited land in Montana with valuable mineral deposits, but the call that really worried him came on Sunday morning. "Tommy, it's your cousin Danny, dude. I just heard the craziest thing. Some guy called Mom asking about you and Uncle Harold's cabin. Said you might have found something valuable up there." Tommy's stomach dropped. "What guy? What did he want?" "I don't know. Some businessman. But Mom told him to call you directly." "Tommy, what's going on? Did you actually find something up there?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Danny. Come on, man. These people wouldn't be calling if there wasn't something to it. My mom said this guy knew all about Uncle Harold's property and was asking if our family had any legal claims to it." After hanging up with Danny, Tommy realized his situation had just gotten much more complicated. It was one thing to have mining companies calling him. It was another thing entirely to have them calling his family, asking about legal claims to the property. Tommy's phone rang again an hour later. This time it was his mom. "Tommy, what is going on?" "I just had some man call here asking about Harold's cabin and whether our family might be interested in selling our inheritance rights, whatever that means." "Mom, I honestly don't know what that's about." "Tommy Rodriguez, don't you lie to me. You found something up there, didn't you? These people don't call about worthless property." "Mom, I'm still trying to figure out what I inherited. I don't know anything for sure yet." "Well, you better figure it out fast, because this man said he was going to call your Uncle Roberto and Aunt Carmen, too. The whole family is going to know something's up." Tommy spent the rest of Sunday fielding calls from relatives who had suddenly become very interested in his vacation to Montana. Everyone wanted to know what he'd found, whether it was really valuable, and what his plans were. The most difficult call came from Lisa. "Tommy, I just got off the phone with your cousin Danny. He said people are calling your family about Uncle Harold's cabin. What aren't you telling me?" Tommy realized he couldn't keep lying to everyone anymore. "Lisa, I think Uncle Harold might have found something valuable on his property. I'm trying to get it verified, but word seems to be getting out." "Valuable how? Like antiques? Or are we talking about real money? Potentially real money?" "But Lisa, I don't know what to do. I'm getting calls from companies I've never heard of, and now they're bothering my family." "Tommy, if this is as big as it sounds, you need professional help. You need a lawyer and probably a financial advisor. You can't handle something like this by yourself. Lisa was right, but Tommy was overwhelmed by how quickly everything was spinning out of control. A week ago, this had been his secret. Now, it felt like half the mining industry knew about his discovery. Monday morning brought even more calls, including one that particularly worried Tommy. Mr. Rodriguez, this is David Chun from Chun and Associates Law Firm. We represent several clients who have legitimate concerns about the mineral rights associated with your recent inheritance. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss these matters. What kind of concerns? There are questions about whether your great-uncle properly acquired all mineral rights to the property, and whether other family members might have claims to any discoveries. These are complex legal issues that need to be resolved before any development can proceed. Tommy hung up feeling sick to his stomach. Not only did everyone seem to know about his discovery, but now there were lawyers suggesting that he might not even legally own what he'd found. That afternoon, Tommy called Dr. Stevens to ask how the information had leaked. I'm afraid this happens more often than you'd think, she said. Geological testing creates paper trails. Lab technicians talk, companies monitor who's having what kinds of samples tested. The mining industry is very good at finding out about new discoveries quickly. What should I do? Get a good lawyer immediately, and be very careful about any offers or partnerships until you understand your legal position completely. Some of these companies are legitimate, but others are just trying to take advantage of people who don't understand the business. That evening, Tommy sat in his apartment surrounded by business cards from companies he'd never heard of, phone messages from family members asking questions he couldn't answer, and the growing realization that his life had changed forever. Thought about Uncle Harold, who had managed to keep this discovery secret for 15 years. Harold had been careful, methodical, and private. Tommy, on the other hand, had managed to let the secret out in less than a week, but maybe that wasn't entirely his fault. Maybe Harold had been able to keep the secret because he'd never tried to get the samples professionally tested. Maybe the moment Tommy decided to verify the discovery, it was inevitable that word would get out. Either way, Tommy was no longer dealing with a private family matter. He was dealing with what appeared to be a significant commercial mineral discovery, and everyone from mining companies to lawyers to his own relatives wanted a piece of it. The question now was whether Tommy could figure out how to protect his interests before someone else took advantage of his inexperience. Tommy knew he was in over his head. After 3 days of constant phone calls and pressure from everyone around him, he made a decision that would change everything. He took a personal day from work and spent it researching environmental lawyers and mining consultants online. The lawyer he finally chose was Patricia Walsh, a woman in her 50s who specialized in mineral rights and environmental law. Her website showed she'd help small landowners navigate deals with major mining companies, and her reviews emphasized that she fought for her clients' interests rather than just facilitating quick sales. Tommy's first meeting with Patricia was an eye-opener. Let me be completely honest with you, she said after reviewing the documents Tommy had brought. You're sitting on what could be worth anywhere from $50 to $200 million, depending on the size and quality of the deposit. But you're also surrounded by sharks who want to convince you to sell for a fraction of that value. How is that even legal? It's perfectly legal. Uninformed landowners sell valuable mineral rights for pennies on the dollar all the time. The key is making sure you understand exactly what you have before you agree to anything. Patricia explained that Tommy's first priority needed to be securing comprehensive geological surveys to determine the full extent of the deposit. Only then could he make informed decisions about development options. There are several paths you could take, Patricia sighed. You could sell the mineral rights outright for a lump sum. You could lease the rights to a mining company for ongoing royalty payments. Or you could partner with an established company and maintain partial ownership of the operation. Which option is best? That depends on your priorities. Do you want immediate cash, long-term income, or maximum control over how the resources are developed? Tommy thought about Harold's notes, which had emphasized environmental protection and community benefit. I want to make sure it's done right. My great-uncle cared about protecting the environment. Patricia smiled. Then you'll want to look at partnership options with companies that specialize in sustainable mining practices. It's more complex, but it gives you more control and potentially much higher long-term returns. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia helped Tommy navigate the overwhelming interest from mining companies. She screened the serious offers from the opportunistic ones, and helped Tommy understand the true value of what he'd inherited. The comprehensive geological survey that Patricia arranged confirmed everyone's hopes. The rare earth element deposit was even larger and more valuable than the preliminary samples had suggested. The surveyors estimated that the deposit could support mining operations for at least 20 years. With solid data in hand, Patricia helped Tommy evaluate partnership proposals from 3 major mining companies. The winner was Green Mountain Resources, a company that specialized in environmentally responsible extraction and had a track record of working with local communities. The deal Tommy ultimately signed was complex but fair. Green Mountain would handle all development costs and regulatory requirements in exchange for a 60-40 split of profits, with Tommy retaining the larger share. The contract included strict environmental protections and requirements for local hiring and community investment, but the real transformation in Tommy's life came when news of the partnership was announced publicly. Tommy's phone started ringing before he'd even finished reading the press release. The first call was from his cousin Danny. "Tommy, dude, I just saw the news online. $50 million? Are you serious?" "Danny, where did you see that?" "It's all over the mining industry websites. Chicago accountant strikes it rich with Montana. Mineral discovery. Tommy, you're famous." Within hours, Tommy's phone was buzzing constantly. But these weren't calls from mining companies anymore. These were calls from family members who suddenly remembered how much they'd always cared about him. His Aunt Carmen called crying. "Tommy, I'm so sorry we didn't take your trip seriously. We should have supported you from the beginning. You know how much Uncle Harold meant to all of us." Tommy remembered Aunt Carmen clearly stating that Harold was a crazy hermit. Just 3 weeks earlier, his Uncle Roberto called with a different approach. "Tommy, this is wonderful news for the whole family. Of course you'll want to share this blessing with everyone who helped raise you. I was thinking maybe we could set up some kind of family trust." "Uncle Roberto, nobody helped me with anything. You all told me to forget about the cabin and sell it for scrap." "Well, we were just trying to protect you from getting your hopes up, but we always knew Harold was special." The most difficult call came from Lisa. Tommy could hear that she'd been crying. "Tommy, I owe you a huge apology. I should have supported your decision to explore the cabin. I should have believed in you. Lisa, you thought I was making a mistake." "Everyone did, but I should have trusted you. I should have been there for you instead of trying to talk you out of it. Can we try again? I realize now how wrong I was." Tommy felt a mix of sadness and disappointment. 3 weeks ago, Lisa had been ready to break up with him over this crazy trip to Montana. Now she wanted to get back together because he was about to become wealthy. "Lisa, I appreciate the apology, but I don't think this is about the money for me. I learned something about myself on this trip, and I learned something about the people around me." The transformation wasn't just in how others treated Tommy, it was in how Tommy saw himself and his future. For the first time in his adult life, Tommy didn't have to worry about rent, or car payments, or whether he'd get promoted at work. The partnership with Green Mountain included an immediate signing bonus of $5 million. With much larger payments to come as mining operations began, Tommy quit his job at the accounting firm, but not in the dramatic way he'd sometimes fantasized about. He simply gave 2 weeks' notice and thanked his boss for the opportunities he'd been given. "You know, Tommy," his boss said, "I always thought you had potential that you weren't using. Maybe this opportunity will help you figure out what you really want to do with your life." Tommy moved out of his cramped Chicago apartment and bought a modest house in a nice neighborhood. Nothing too flashy. He remembered Harold's example of living simply despite having access to wealth, but the biggest change was in Tommy's sense of purpose. Working with Green Mountain on the mining development, Tommy discovered he had a talent for understanding complex environmental and business issues. He enrolled in evening classes to learn more about geology, environmental science, and sustainable development. Tommy also established the Harold Rodriguez Foundation, dedicated to funding geological research and environmental conservation in rural communities. It felt like the right way to honor his great-uncle's memory and values. The first major test of Tommy's transformation came at the family Christmas gathering that year. The same relatives who had mocked his inheritance now treated him like the most important person in the room. "Tommy, you have to tell us the whole story," his cousin Danny said. "How did you know to look for valuable minerals?" "I didn't know anything," Tommy replied honestly. "I just followed Uncle Harold's research and got lucky." "But you must have had some sense that there was more to it than an old cabin," Aunt Carmen insisted. Tommy looked around the room at all the family members who had laughed at him just months earlier. "Actually, I remember most of you telling me I was wasting my time and money." The room got quiet for a moment. "Well," Uncle Roberto said finally, "the important thing is that you didn't listen to us. You followed your instincts." Tommy realized this was probably the closest thing to an apology he was going to get from most of his family. But he also realized he didn't need their validation anymore. The experience with Uncle Harold's inheritance had taught Tommy something valuable about people and relationships. When he was struggling financially, most people treated his problems as character flaws. Now that he was wealthy, those same people wanted to treat his success as something they'd always believed in. But Tommy had also discovered something positive about himself. When everyone around him said he was making a mistake, he'd trusted his own judgment and seen it through. That confidence was worth more to him than the money. Tommy's transformation from a struggling accountant to a multimillionaire was remarkable. But his transformation from someone who let others define his worth to someone who trusted his own instincts was even more important. As he looked around the Christmas dinner table at relatives who were now competing for his attention and approval, Tommy understood why Uncle Harold had chosen to live quietly in the mountains, away from people who only valued him for what he could provide. But unlike Harold, Tommy wasn't going to isolate himself. He was going to use his newfound wealth and confidence to build genuine relationships with people who valued him for who he was, not what he owned. The kid who everyone had laughed at for chasing a worthless inheritance had become a man who could choose his own path in life. And that transformation, Tommy realized, was the most valuable thing Uncle Harold had left him.